The vast, infinite expanse of space had always been a comfort to Captain Daniel Reynolds. It was an endless ocean of silence where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. But as the Aurora approached the shadowed silhouette of Series 1, he felt a chill creeping up his spine, a sense of foreboding that he hadn't felt in all his years of exploration. This wasn't just another mission. There was something wrong with this place, something deeply, impossibly wrong. The station loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness, half hidden behind the curve of the uncharted planet it orbited. It looked ancient, like a relic from a time long forgotten, with its exterior panels scorched and pitted, some hanging loose as if something had torn at them. It shouldn't have been there, according to every record. Series 1 had been lost over 30 years ago, and no one had any reason to believe it was still operational. Yet, here it was, sending out a faint, erratic distress signal like a heartbeat barely clinging to life. "Approaching docking bay, Captain," said Lieutenant Kepler, his voice tense, eyes fixed on the controls. He was the ship's engineer, a methodical and precise man who had seen his fair share of abandoned vessels. But even he had to admit that something about this one felt different, like it was daring them to come closer. "Take it slow," Reynolds replied, his gaze locked on the station's darkened windows. "We don't know what's waiting for us." The Aurora moved forward, its docking clamps extending toward the battered airlock of Series 1. There was a moment of tension as the ship's systems worked to establish a secure connection. Then, with a metallic clang, they were latched on. The eerie silence that followed was deafening. "Connection stable," reported Dr. Isaac Harris, the AI specialist. His eyes flickered with unease as he checked the readings. "The station's main systems are running on minimal power. It's like it's been in standby mode for decades, just waiting for someone to reactivate it." Reynolds nodded, though he found little comfort in those words. "All right, we move in pairs. We get in, find out what's going on, and get out. No unnecessary risks. Dr. Thorne, you're with Dr. Harris. Kepler, you're with me." Dr. Ilara Thorne, the team's xenobiologist, gave a quick nod. Her face was a mask of determination, but there was a flicker of excitement in her eyes. She had been insistent on joining the mission, driven by the possibility of finding something unique, something alien. The notion of discovering lost alien technology or artifacts was a scientist's dream. But dreams had a way of turning into nightmares when faced with the unknown. They gathered their equipment, checked their oxygen levels, and suited up. As they prepared to step into the airlock, Reynolds hesitated for just a second, glancing back at the interior of the Aurora. It was clean, well-lit, and familiar. For a moment, he felt an inexplicable urge to stay, to turn the ship around and leave this cursed place to rot. But orders were orders, and curiosity was a powerful thing. The airlock hissed open, and the crew of the Aurora stepped into the darkness of Series 1. The corridor beyond was pitch black, save for the thin beams of their flashlights cutting through the murk. It was colder than they had anticipated, and the metal walls were slick with condensation, as if the station had been slowly leaking its warmth into the void for years. There was no sound except the echo of their footsteps, each one a hollow, unsettling note that reverberated down the empty hallways. "Power's low," said Harris, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "I'm trying to get a read on the station's systems, but there's interference. Something's scrambling the signals." "Keep trying," Reynolds ordered. "Thorn, anything unusual?" The xenobiologist swept her light across the walls, her breath fogging up the visor of her helmet. "The air composition is off," she murmured. "It's breathable, but there are traces of something else, something organic. I can't identify it yet." Reynolds' jaw tightened. The corridors stretched out in all directions, a maze of shadows and metal, with no clear indication of where they led. "All right, we'll split up. Kepler and I will head to the command center, see if we can bring the main systems online. Thorn, Harris, you head to the labs, find out what they were doing here." "Understood," Thorn said, though Reynolds could see the apprehension in her eyes. She was excited, but there was a nervous edge to her movements, like a hunter stepping into unfamiliar territory. As they moved deeper into the station, they began to see signs of a struggle. Equipment was scattered across the floor, some of it smashed beyond recognition. Long, jagged scratches marred the walls, trailing off into the darkness. It was as if something had been dragged or had crawled, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. No bodies, though. No signs of the previous crew. Just the lingering echoes of chaos. Kepler's voice crackled over the comms. "I don't like this, Captain. It feels like we're being watched." Reynolds couldn't deny it. There was a presence here, something unseen and malevolent, hiding just beyond the edge of their lights. He tried to shake off the feeling. "Stay sharp. We're not alone in here." Reynolds and Kepler arrived at the command center, a vast room lined with rows of darkened consoles and monitors. The screens were coated in a thin layer of dust, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Reynolds moved to the main console and began to power it up. The lights flickered to life, revealing the room in harsh, clinical detail. "What the hell?" Kepler whispered, staring at the screen. The main console displayed a series of logs, dated to the final days before Series 1 went dark. The last entries were corrupted, filled with static and nonsensical symbols, but the text that was legible spoke of experiments, of something that had been found beneath the planet's surface, a discovery that was not meant to be. "Containment compromised. They won't stop whispering," Reynolds read aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. "If anyone finds this, leave. Do not wake it." Kepler shivered. What were they talking about? Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't have to. The whispers had started, faint and almost inaudible, creeping through the static like a distant voice calling out from the void. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the shadows, a flicker of something inhuman. But when he turned, there was nothing there. "We need to regroup," he said, his voice firm. "Let's get the others and get out of here." Meanwhile, in the lab sections, Thorn and Harris had made a discovery of their own. The lab was in shambles, equipment strewn everywhere, but there were signs of recent activity. A microscope still powered on, a scalpel lying on a tray, glistening with something dark and viscous. "This isn't right," Harris muttered, scanning the room. "If this place has been abandoned for decades, who's been down here?" Thorn's light caught on a series of glass containers, each one filled with a thick, black fluid. There were things suspended in the fluid, twisted, alien forms, as if something had been growing or mutating in those tanks. She approached one, her curiosity overcoming her fear. The thing inside the glass twitched, ever so slightly, its dark eyes snapping open, fixing on her. The station shuddered, the lights flickering as the whispers grew louder. Dr. Thorne stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Harris, we need to..." But the words died on her lips as she realized the whispers were speaking to her, using her name, calling her closer. Dr. Elara Thorne's hands trembled as she adjusted the flashlight attached to her suit. The dim, cold corridors of Series 1 seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in unnatural ways, as though the station had no intention of letting them navigate it easily. The oppressive darkness was thick, almost tangible, pressing down on her like a weight. She glanced at Dr. Isaac Harris, who walked beside her, his face partially obscured by shadows. He was tapping furiously at his portable console, trying to make sense of the garbled data streams that kept flashing on the screen. "Anything yet?" she asked, her voice echoing down the hallway, amplified by the hollow metallic stillness around them. "Interference," Harris muttered. "It's like the station doesn't want us to know what's happening. Every time I try to access the logs, they corrupt themselves. But I did find something big. The layout of the station doesn't match the schematics we were given." "What do you mean?" "I mean there are sections here that don't exist on any blueprint we've seen. Entire wings hidden deep within the structure. It's like someone went out of their way to keep them secret." Thorne felt a chill run down her spine. She'd been on many missions, seen things that would make most people lose sleep, but this felt different. It was as though the station was alive, hiding its secrets, luring them deeper with each step. "So where are we headed now?" Harris's console beeped as a map flickered into view. It was crude, full of gaps and inconsistencies, but there was a clear destination marked at the center, buried deep within the station. "There's a restricted lab area far below the main research levels. That's where most of the energy signals are coming from. If we're going to find answers, that's where we need to go." The journey to the lower levels felt like a descent into madness. As they made their way down, the corridors grew narrower, the walls closing in around them, suffocating and oppressive. The cold metal floors creaked under their boots, and the air became damp, carrying a faint, foul odor that made Thorne's stomach turn. It smelled like rot, like something long dead. As they moved through a particularly dark section of the corridor, Harris's light caught on something unusual, a series of jagged blackened growths spreading across the walls. They pulsated faintly, as though they were breathing, stretching out like veins through the station's infrastructure. They were unlike anything Thorne had seen, organic yet mechanical, glistening under the harsh light of their flashlights. "Is that part of the station?" Thorne asked, leaning in closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. Harris hesitated, scanning the growth with his console. "Number. It's not supposed to be here. It's growing, almost like a fungus, but denser. And there are traces of some kind of biological matter, something alive. The way the growths seemed to pulse in sync with the faint hum of the station made Thorne's skin crawl. She stepped back, her heart pounding faster. "Whatever it is, we need to be careful. Let's keep moving." They finally reached a large set of heavy reinforced doors, sealed tight, with warning signs plastered across them in various languages. The words "restricted access," "biohazard," and "do not open" were faded but still legible, as if someone had painted them in a hurry. Harris worked on bypassing the security lock, his hands shaking slightly as he punched in codes, rewiring circuits. "You're sure this is a good idea?" Thorn whispered, feeling a sudden pang of dread. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But curiosity, that fatal flaw of all scientists, kept her rooted to the spot. Harris didn't respond, and after a few tense moments, the lock clicked, and the door slowly slid open, releasing a hiss of pressurized air. The lights inside flickered, struggling to maintain power, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the room. They stepped inside and froze. The lab was massive, larger than they had expected, a cavernous space filled with rows of tanks, machinery, and equipment that looked decades old but still functional. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the same sickly sweet odor of decay. Some of the tanks were broken, shattered glass and dark, viscous fluid spilling out across the floor. Others were intact, but what lay inside made Thorn's blood run cold. Suspended in the fluid were twisted, deformed shapes, creatures that defied logic, with limbs that bent in impossible ways, eyes that were too large or too small, and skin that seemed to ripple and shift even while they remained motionless. Some resembled vaguely humanoid figures, but others were far more alien, with features that twisted and contorted like nightmares brought to life. "My God," Thorn whispered, stepping closer to one of the tanks, unable to tear her eyes away from the thing inside. It was a mass of limbs, each one extending from a central amorphous body, with no clear head or face. Yet she could sense it was watching her, as though it could see her through the glass. What were they doing here? Harris scanned the room, his face pale. These things aren't from here. They must have been experimenting on them, trying to, I don't know, study them, control them. Or create them, Thorn added softly, the words hanging heavily in the stale air. The thought of it was horrifying. What kind of minds could conceive of such things? And why? In the dim light, Harris spotted a control panel at the far end of the room. It was still active, flickering with faint green luminescence. We need to find out more. Maybe there's something here that can explain this, he said, gesturing to the grotesque forms in the tanks. Thorn hesitated. Every fiber of her being wanted to leave, to get out of this nightmare. But she nodded. They had to know. They had to understand what had happened here. As Harris began to access the terminal, a series of research logs appeared on the screen, dated to the last days before Series 1 went silent. The entries were mostly corrupted, but a few were still intact, including video files. The first video flickered to life, showing a man with hollow eyes and a disheveled appearance. His ID badge identified him as Dr. Andros, the chief scientist. He spoke quickly, his voice strained, as though he was struggling to get the words out. If anyone finds this, I pray you're smarter than we were. We thought we could control it, understand it, but it understands us more than we could ever comprehend. It's been reaching out, whispering, telling us things, showing us things. We thought they were just dreams, but they weren't. They were memories. Memories from something far older than we are. It's in the walls, in the air, and it wants to get out. Harris froze, his fingers hovering over the controls. What the hell is he talking about? Another video file loaded, showing Dr. Andros again, but this time he was visibly distressed, his hands shaking, his eyes darting around as if he was seeing things that weren't there. We found it beneath the planet's surface. We thought it was dormant, but it was waiting. It spoke to us. It's not a machine, not a life form. It's something else, something that shouldn't exist. We try to seal it away, but it's too late. If you're hearing this, don't try to fight it. Run. Get as far away as you can and pray it doesn't follow." The screen went dark, leaving only the faint hum of the equipment and the distant rhythmic thrum of the station's core. Thorne and Harris exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever the crew of Series 1 had unleashed, it was still here, and it was waiting for them. As they turned to leave, a sharp metallic screech echoed through the lab, followed by the soft, wet sound of something dragging itself across the floor. Thorne spun around, her flashlight flickering across the tanks. One of them was cracked, and a dark, viscous fluid was seeping out, pooling around the base. Something moved within the darkness, a twisted skeletal hand reaching out, clawing at the glass, leaving deep scratches. Harris stepped back, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to go. Now." Thorne didn't argue. They bolted, running through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing, chased by the sound of glass shattering, and the soft, steady whisper that seemed to follow them, growing louder with every step. It spoke in a language they didn't understand, but the intent was clear. It was awake, and it was hungry. They stumbled back into the corridor, slamming the door behind them, sealing whatever was inside. For a moment they stood there, gasping for breath, trying to comprehend the horror they had seen. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, resonating through the walls, through their suits, into their minds, echoing with a single chilling word. "Come." The Aurora's crew had seen their share of strange and harrowing things, but as Captain Reynolds and Lieutenant Kepler made their way through the maze of corridors back to the labs, it became clear that Series 1 was different. The station wasn't just abandoned, it was wrong, as if reality itself was slowly unraveling the closer they got to its core. They moved quickly, their flashlights cutting through the dark, but no matter how fast they walked, the shadows seemed to creep closer, stretching out like grasping fingers. "Thorne, Harris, come in." "Do you copy?" Reynolds said into his comm, but all he received in return was a burst of static, followed by faint, distorted voices. They were speaking, but not in a language he recognized. It was a low, rhythmic murmur, more felt than heard, as though it was bypassing his ears and crawling directly into his brain. "They should have responded by now," Kepler said, his voice laced with unease. He'd never heard anything like it, sound that seemed to press into him, pulling at the edges of his sanity. "You don't think they—" "Don't finish that thought," Reynolds interrupted sharply. "We're going to find them, and then we're going to get the hell off this station." But deep down, a cold, creeping fear gnawed at him. The words of Dr. Andros, recorded in the final moments before the station went silent, echoed in his mind. "We thought it was dormant, but it was waiting." Reynolds had seen enough to know that whatever Series 1 had uncovered, it wasn't something that could be understood or controlled. It was something that fed on curiosity, drawing them deeper into its web. They found Thorne and Harris at the end of a long, darkened corridor, standing in front of a large, reinforced door that looked like it had been sealed shut for decades. The air around them was thick, almost suffocating, and Reynolds could see the tension in their postures, the way they stood rigid and unmoving, like statues. "Thorne," he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. She turned slowly, her eyes wide, reflecting the dim light. For a moment, Reynolds thought he saw something strange flickering behind her pupils, something dark and liquid, as if shadows were swimming just beneath the surface. "Captain," she said, her voice unnaturally calm, almost serene. "We found it. The core." Reynolds and Kepler exchanged a wary glance. "What do you mean, the core? What's in there?" Reynolds asked. Harris stepped forward, clutching his console tightly. "It's not just a power source. It's more than that. It's like a brain or a heart. It's alive in a way I can't explain, and it's calling to us." "Calling to us?" Kepler's voice was incredulous. "What the hell are you talking about?" Thorne's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "It's awake, Captain. It was never truly asleep. It was just waiting for someone to listen." The reinforced door creaked open with a slow, mechanical groan, revealing the chamber beyond. Reynolds hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but the others stepped forward, drawn by an invisible pull. The room was vast, far larger than it had any right to be, and at its center was a massive, spherical object, smooth, dark, and pulsating with a rhythmic, organic glow. Tendrils of dark, oily material extended from its surface, winding around the room, snaking into the walls and floor, as though the core was feeding off the very structure of the station. For a moment, Reynolds couldn't move. The sight of it was paralyzing, like staring into the abyss and realizing it was staring back. The core throbbed, its surface undulating with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat. And then, without warning, the whispers flooded his mind, drowning out every other sound, every other thought. "You have come." The words reverberated through him, not as sound, but as a feeling, a vibration that pulsed through his bones. He glanced at the others, and from their wide, horrified eyes, he knew they were hearing it too. "What is it?" Kepler whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he was afraid to speak too loudly, lest he draw its attention. "It's a part of something larger," Harris said, his hands trembling as he looked at the core. "Something vast. It stretches beyond this station, beyond this planet. It's like a node, a connection point. But to what? I can't." The core pulsed again, and the room seemed to twist around them, the walls bending, contorting, as if the space itself was being stretched. Shadows swirled along the edges of the chamber, shifting and coiling, forming shapes that flickered in and out of existence. For a moment, Reynolds thought he could see faces within the darkness, distorted, hollow-eyed figures, their mouths twisted into silent screams. "Stop," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But as he turned to leave, Thorne grabbed his arm, her grip shockingly strong. "No, Captain, we have to understand it. Don't you see? It's showing us everything. It's reaching out, trying to connect. We can't just run." Her eyes had changed. They were no longer the bright, intelligent eyes of the woman he'd known for years. They were dark, as if filled with a black, inky substance that seemed to swirl and shift, hiding something deeper within. For a moment, Reynolds thought he could see a reflection of himself in them, but the image was wrong, distorted, twisted, as though he was looking at a version of himself that had been stretched and warped by some unseen force. "Thorne, let go," he said, but she didn't release him. Her face was blank, expressionless, except for that unsettling smile. "We have to open it," she whispered, leaning in closer, her breath cold against his skin. "It's been sealed away for so long, but it's ready now. It's ready to be free." Kepler stepped forward, pulling her back. "What the hell are you talking about? What's gotten into you?" but Thorn just laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the chamber. You can't fight it. It's in the walls, in the air, in us. You think you're separate, but you've been part of it since you arrived. As she spoke, the core began to change, its surface shifting, splitting open to reveal a dark, yawning void within. Tendrils of black, shimmering material extended outward, reaching for them, twisting through the air like serpents. Reynolds stumbled back, but the tendrils moved with an unnatural speed, coiling around his arms, his legs, pulling him closer. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat, replaced by the whispers that flooded his mind, louder now, clearer. We are infinite, we are eternal, and you are ours. Harris moved frantically, his console sparking as he tried to sever the connection, to shut down the core. But every command he entered was overridden, the screens filling with incomprehensible symbols. It's too powerful, he said, his voice cracking with panic. It's controlling the station, using it to amplify its reach. We have to destroy it, or it will consume us all. How? Reynolds managed to say, struggling against the tendrils. How do we stop it? Harris's eyes flicked to the reactor controls, and Reynolds understood. If they couldn't shut it down, they could overload it. But the risk was immense. If they failed, the entire station would be vaporized along with them. Kepler moved to the controls, his hands shaking. We don't have a choice, do we? No, Reynolds said, the tendrils tightening around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Do it. The core seemed to sense what they were trying to do. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, a cacophony of voices speaking over one another, their words twisting and merging, forming a single unified command. Join us. Merge with us. Become one. Thorn's voice cut through the chaos, but it wasn't her own. It was deeper, resonant, like something ancient was speaking through her. It doesn't have to end this way, Captain. Let it in. Let it be free, and you will be free. Reynolds met her gaze, and for a moment, he hesitated. There was something compelling, almost comforting, in the way she spoke. But then he saw it again. The reflection in her eyes, the twisted, distorted version of himself. And he understood. The core wasn't offering freedom. It was offering oblivion, the kind of existence that devoured everything it touched, leaving nothing behind. Kepler, now! He shouted. The reactor began to overload, the room filling with a blinding, searing light as the core's tendrils recoiled, thrashing violently. The chamber shook, metal groaning and twisting, as though the station itself was screaming in agony. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, a single wordless cry that echoed through the minds of everyone on board. No! The core's surface split, cracking, shattering, as the tendrils snapped and withered. For a brief, terrible moment, Reynolds felt the presence within the core, an ancient, endless consciousness, vast and unknowable, reaching out to him, trying to pull him into the darkness. And then, with a final thunderous crack, the core imploded, collapsing in on itself, dragging the shadows into the void. The room went silent, the light fading, leaving only the dull, rhythmic hum of the reactor. Reynolds collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his vision swimming. For a moment he thought it was over, but as he looked up, he saw Thorn standing at the edge of the chamber, her dark, inky eyes still fixed on him, still smiling. "It's not gone," she whispered as the alarms began to blare, signaling the imminent collapse of the station. "It's awake, and it's everywhere." The station was dying, Alarms screamed through the hollow corridors, a cacophony of blaring sirens and flashing red lights, bathing everything in a pulsating, hellish glow. Series 1 was tearing itself apart, the structure groaning and buckling as if some great invisible hand was crushing it, piece by piece. Captain Reynolds could feel the tremors beneath his feet, the vibrations growing stronger, more violent, as he and the others stumbled through the dark, twisting corridors toward the reactor. He could hear the whispers, faint but insistent, crawling at the edges of his mind. They were no longer the distant murmurs that had haunted him since they arrived. Now they were loud, clear, a chorus of voices overlapping, twisting together, forming a single suffocating presence that filled the air around them. It was as if the station was speaking to them, calling to them, drawing them deeper into its grasp. You cannot escape. Reynolds pushed forward, dragging Thorne along with him. She was half-conscious, her eyes rolling back, her lips still muttering in that strange alien tongue. Whatever had been awakened in the core had left a mark on her, and Reynolds didn't know if she could come back from it. But he wasn't going to abandon her. Not yet. "Harris! Kepler!" Reynolds shouted, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "We're almost at the reactor. Tell me you've got a plan." "We need to overload it manually," Harris replied, his face pale, drenched in sweat. He looked like a man who had been fighting against his own mind, trying to hold back the tide. "If we can create a feedback loop, it'll destroy the core's connection to the station. But it'll take everything with it." Reynolds glanced back at the twisting shadows creeping along the walls, the way they seemed to pulse and shift, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. Everything? "The station, the planet, us," Kepler said, his hands trembling as he adjusted the controls on his portable console. "We'll have less than 5 minutes to get clear before it all goes." "Do it," Reynolds said without hesitation. He knew what was at stake. Whatever was inside the core, whatever had been waiting all this time, couldn't be allowed to escape. If it reached the outside world, if it spread, there wouldn't be anything left to save. "Just tell me what we need to do." The reactor chamber was a vast, cavernous space, dominated by a massive cylindrical core that pulsed with a sickly green light. It was like a heart, beating slowly, methodically, sending waves of energy thrumming through the station's walls. But now there were tendrils, dark, oily strands extending from the core's shattered remains, snaking their way into the reactor, feeding off its power. The tendrils pulsed, throbbing, like veins pumping blood into something hidden, something waiting to emerge. Harris and Kepler moved quickly, pulling open access panels, their hands a blur as they began to reroute power, bypassing safety protocols. Reynolds stood guard, his eyes scanning the room, watching as the shadows shifted and coiled, whispering to him, taunting him. "Why do you resist?" the voices murmured, their tone almost gentle, like a parent soothing a frightened child. "You are part of us. You have always been part of us." Reynolds clenched his fists, trying to drown out the voices, trying to focus on the task at hand. But it was becoming harder, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, burrowing into his thoughts. He could feel it inside his mind, probing, searching, trying to find a way in. It was cold, relentless, and it terrified him. "Captain!" Kepler shouted, snapping him out of his trance. "The core, it's reacting to what we're doing. We need more time." The core's tendrils twitched, convulsing, as if they were aware of the sabotage. The green light intensified, flashing brighter, faster, casting harsh, jagged shadows across the room. Reynolds could see the darkness swirling, thickening, forming shapes that weren't quite human. Elongated limbs, eyeless faces, mouths that stretched impossibly wide, grinning with teeth that glistened like shards of glass. And then, from the center of the reactor chamber, a figure began to emerge. It was Thorn, but it wasn't her. The thing that stood before them was wearing her face, her body, but it was hollow, empty, as if something had crawled inside her skin and taken control. Her eyes were black, dark, and endless, and when she spoke, it was in a voice that was not her own. "You cannot destroy what is eternal. You are nothing. Flesh, dust. You will be consumed, and we will be free." Reynolds raised his weapon, his hands shaking. "Thorn, if you can hear me, you need to fight it. You need to come back." But the thing that had taken her just smiled, tilting its head slightly, as if amused by his defiance. "She is gone. She was weak, and we are strong. We will outlast you, outlast everything. We have waited, and we will wait again." The lights in the room flickered, dimmed, and then flared back to life, blindingly bright. Reynolds blinked, disoriented, and when his vision cleared, the thing wearing Thorn's face was gone. But the whispers remained, louder now, echoing through the reactor chamber, growing more frantic, more desperate. "Reynolds!" Harris shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "We've got it, but we need to activate the manual override from the console at the base of the reactor. It's the only way to start the sequence." Reynolds didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the room, his boots pounding against the metal floor, his breath ragged. He could feel the tendrils reaching for him, brushing against his skin, cold and wet, trying to pull him back, to stop him. But he kept moving, his eyes fixed on the console, his mind focused on the one thing that mattered, stopping this nightmare from spreading any further. He reached the console, slamming his hand down on the activation switch. The reactor roared to life, the feedback loop engaging, sending waves of energy surging back through the system. The core convulsed, its tendrils snapping, writhing as if in pain. The whispers became screams, a cacophony of voices shrieking in unison, furious, terrified. "You will die with us. You will die with us." Reynolds felt the floor beneath him buckle, the entire station shuddering as the reactor began to overload. The green light flickered, pulsed, and then began to darken, as if something was draining the life out of it. He could see the core cracking, fracturing, its dark surface splitting open, revealing the void within, a void that seemed to stretch on forever, deeper than any abyss, darker than any night. The tendrils lashed out, one final, desperate attempt to stop the inevitable. They wrapped around Reynolds's arms, his legs, pulling him closer to the core, dragging him toward the dark, yawning chasm at its center. He could feel it pulling at his mind, trying to force him to let go, to give in. But then, through the haze of whispers, he heard a voice, faint, weak but unmistakably Thorn's. "Fight it." The words cut through the darkness, clear and strong, and for a moment Reynolds could see her, really see her, standing there, her eyes bright and full of life, free from the darkness that had claimed her. She was reaching out to him, her hand extended, and he knew that if he let go, if he gave in, she would be lost forever. With a roar, he pulled free, tearing the tendrils away, ripping himself from their grasp. He slammed the final override switch, and the reactor began to scream, a high-pitched, deafening wail as the overload sequence initiated. The core shrieked, the voices howling in agony, and the dark tendrils recoiled, retreating into the cracks, into the void. No. The chamber was blindingly bright, the light growing hotter, fiercer, as the reactor's energy surged to critical levels. Reynolds stumbled back, barely able to see, barely able to breathe, as the core began to collapse, folding in on itself, dragging the shadows with it, pulling everything into the abyss. For a moment, he thought he could see faces in the darkness, human and inhuman, mouths open in silent screams, before they were swallowed by the void. And then, with a deafening roar, the core imploded, a wave of light and heat exploding outward, consuming the reactor, the chamber, the entire station. The Aurora drifted in the void, silent and dark, as the shock wave rippled through space, a bright, searing flash that lit up the cold, empty sky. Inside, the emergency lights flickered, and Reynolds blinked, dazed, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He looked around, trying to find the others, but there was only silence, the faint hum of the ship's systems, the only sign of life. Kepler. Harris. "Do you read me?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. There was a crackle of static, and then Kepler's voice came through, weak but steady. We're here, Captain. We made it." Reynolds slumped back, his body heavy with exhaustion, relief flooding through him. "The station." "Gone," Harris said, his voice distant, almost reverent. "Everything. Gone." For a moment there was only silence, and then the faint, distant hum of the Aurora's engines as they began to power up, ready to take them home. Reynolds closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, trying to forget the whispers, the darkness, the faces in the void. But as the ship began to move, drifting away from the planet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, still waiting. And when he opened his eyes, he saw it, a faint, blinking light on the edge of the planet's shadow, like a distant star. Another signal, another station. We are infinite, we are eternal, and we will wait.